Washington State, October. A mountain that has been keeping a secret for over 100 years. Deep in the forest where the trees grow old enough to forget they were ever saplings, there is a root gap beneath a massive pine that no map has ever marked. It looks like nothing. Most people walk past it without slowing down. A dog stops. He has been walking for 3 days through rain that didn't care. He stops here, ears up, certain. Inside the gap, a cave. Inside the cave, a house. Inside the house, on a table in the center of the room, a small glass vase with living herbs. Still fresh. Someone was here within the week. And in the vault behind the house, floor to ceiling, wall to wall, 200 sealed containers, each one labeled by the same hand, each one bearing the same two initials. E. Vane. A 17-year-old girl reads that name. She already knows it. The last thing her grandmother ever said to her was about a plant. Not about the house, not about the money from the estate that went to a cousin Mira had met exactly twice, not about what would happen to them after, just about a plant. Her grandmother had been lying in the hospital bed they'd rented for the living room, and she'd held Mira's hand with the grip of someone who still had things to say and was running out of time to say them. And she'd said, "I never found it. I looked for it my whole life and I never found it." And then she'd closed her eyes. That was it. That was the last conversation. Mira had not known standing in the hallway after what plant she meant. She'd assumed it was grief talking, old grief in the shape of old words. She'd gone back into the room and held her grandmother's hand until morning. 3 weeks later, she understood that the plant was real. That was also the day they lost the house. Her name was Mira Vane. She was 17 years old. She had $61 in a backpack and a brother who was 11, and a dog who had belonged to her grandmother, and a quilt that had also belonged to her grandmother, and a small green journal with a cracked spine that she'd found in the drawer of her grandmother's bedside table the morning after she died. She had those things and nothing else. And she had a cousin named Paul who had driven 4 hours to inventory the house and had handed her an envelope with the $61 inside and said he was sorry, but the estate had debts and the house would need to be sold. She'd stood on the porch of that house. She'd looked at Paul's car in the driveway, at his license plates from a state she'd never been to, at the way he kept checking his phone while he talked to her. She'd said, "We need a few more days." He'd said, "I'm sorry." She'd said 2 days, just 2 days to figure out. He'd said, "I'm really sorry. The cleaners are coming Thursday." That was a Tuesday. That was 3 days ago. Now, it was raining in the kind of way that Washington State rained in October, which was not dramatically, which was worse than dramatic. It was just rain. Constant. Gray. The kind that wasn't heavy enough to run from because there was nowhere to run to, and just persistent enough that everything you owned was wet through. Mira walked. Luca walked behind her. He didn't complain. He was 11 years old, and he had their grandmother's particular quality of absorbing information quietly before deciding what he felt about it. He'd been absorbing for 3 days. She didn't know when he was going to finish. Dutch walked ahead of both of them. The dog was the only one of the three who seemed fine. He was a large animal mixed breed with thick gray-brown fur and the kind of steady trot that suggested he had a destination in mind, even when nobody had told him where they were going. He'd been their grandmother's dog for 9 years. He'd been their dog for 3 weeks. The transition had been seamless on his end. Mira envied that. The forest they were walking through was state land, technically. She knew that. She also knew that technically was doing a lot of work in that sentence. She had $61 and a brother and a dog and no address and no plan. What the state thought about her walking through its forest was a problem she would deal with when it became a more immediate problem than the one she already had. The rain kept coming. She pulled her jacket tighter, which helped nothing. The jacket had reached its saturation point about 2 hours ago. Pulling it tighter just redistributed the wet. Luca said Dutch is going faster. She said, "Yeah." He said he does that when he knows something. She said he's a dog. Luca said he knew when B died. Before the machines did. Mira didn't answer that, because he wasn't wrong. The The dog had moved from his usual spot by the door to her grandmother's bedside 6 hours before the heart monitor changed, had pressed his head against her hand and stayed there. Dogs know things. That was what their grandmother said. Dogs know things, and they know them without needing to be taught. Mira put her hand into her jacket pocket. The journal was there. She'd wrapped it in a plastic bag from the gas station, the only thing she'd had. She could feel the shape of it through the plastic. Small, about the size of a large index card. The cover was green cloth, worn at the corners. Her grandmother had kept it in her bedside drawer for as long as Mira could remember. And Mira had never once asked what was in it. She wished she'd asked. She wished she'd asked a lot of things. Dutch stopped, completely, between one stride and the next from moving to still. Ears up, nose working at something specific, something low, something in the direction of a massive old tree whose roots had surfaced and spread and crossed and knotted themselves into a structure almost as complex as the tree above. Mira stopped. Luca walked into her. He said, "What?" She said, "Dutch stopped." He looked at the dog, at the tree, at the base of the tree where the roots met the hillside. He said, "There's something there." She said, "It's roots." He said, "Under the roots." She aimed her flashlight because she'd packed one. She'd packed a flashlight and the journal and the quilt and a change of clothes, each and 3 days of food and her $61. She'd done all that while Paul stood in the doorway saying he was sorry on a Tuesday. The flashlight beam hit the roots and traveled along them to where they met the rock. A gap. Not a big gap, maybe 2 feet wide, maybe 18 inches tall where the largest root arched over it. The kind of gap you'd miss entirely if you were not standing at the exact right angle, in the exact right light at the exact right moment. She looked at Dutch. Dutch was looking at the gap with his whole body. Ears forward, weight shifted slightly toward it. Tail not moving. She said, "Luca, stay." Luca said, "Absolutely not." She opened her mouth. He said, "I've been following you for 3 days, and it hasn't gotten worse than this." "I'm not staying." She didn't have a good counter-argument for that. She crouched and went through first. The root scraped her shoulder. The rock scraped her other shoulder. The gap was exactly as tight as it looked from outside. She got through by going sideways and keeping her breath out. Then she was inside. She stood up. She turned on the flashlight. Dark, cave, the ceiling maybe 8 feet up the floor, uneven but solid. Dry. Actually completely dry. The smell of the outside, the wet and the pine and the cold rain stopped at the threshold. In here, stone. And underneath stone, something else. Something woody and dry and faintly sweet. She swept the flashlight left. Stone wall. Right. Stone wall. Ahead. She swept it ahead, and then she stopped sweeping because there was something ahead that was not stone wall. Something made of wood. A structure, a house, built against the back of the cave and extending to both sides of the main chamber. Not ruins, not a collapsed shelter. A real house with real walls and real windows, and a real porch, the wood weathered to a dark gray but intact. The windows dusty but whole, the porch extending the full width of the front wall, with 3 wooden steps leading up. And the cave wasn't just one chamber. There were openings on each side of the house. One to the right, which showed shelves and a work table. One to the left, which showed more darkness, but the kind of darkness that felt different from the main chamber, cooler and wetter, like there was water somewhere beyond it. And a third further back to the right, past the workshop opening, which she couldn't see into from here. Dutch came through the gap behind her. She heard his claws on the cave floor. Then Luca, who scraped both shoulders going through and didn't complain about it. Luca stood up and aimed his own flashlight, the small one from his pack at the house. He said, "Oh." Dutch walked forward, not rushing, just walked with the steady, purposeful trot of an animal who had reached a destination. He went up the 3 porch steps, sat in front of the door, and looked back at them. Luca said, "He's seen this before." Mira said, "He hasn't seen this before." Luca said, His tail is moving. It was, slowly. The specific tail movement that meant good place. Mira crossed to the porch. The wood held her weight. The steps held. Old but solid, the grain tight, the kind of wood that had been chosen carefully and built to last. She put her hand on the door. She stopped. She looked at Dutch, who was sitting right beside her foot and whose tail was still moving. She pushed the door open. The smell that came out was not what she expected. Not mold, not rot, not the smell of a closed place. The smell was old wood and dried herbs, and something underneath both of those, something that she recognized without being able to immediately name. Warm and specific, like the smell of her grandmother's kitchen when she was making something she'd been making for a long time. Dutch walked inside. Mira went in behind him. The main room was generous. The ceiling went up into the cave above the roofline, giving the space a strange height. A stone fireplace on the right wall built into the cave rock, substantial, with two iron hooks still mounted on the mantel. Wooden shelves on the left, some empty, some holding things. A ceramic bowl, a stack of folded cloths, an old tin box. A table in the center, round and solid with four chairs. And on the table, a small glass vase with a sprig of greenery in it. Green, living, not dried, not wilted, completely alive, the leaves still holding their color, the stems still turgid with water. Mira crossed to the table and touched one leaf with one finger. Not dried, not old, fresh. Someone had put this here within the last several days. Luca said, Mira, she said, I see it. He said, that's not from outside. That's not a weed. Look at the leaves. She looked. The leaves were small and serrated, and she didn't know what she was looking at, but he was right. This was not something she recognized from the forest they'd walked through. She said, somebody's been here. He said, recently. She said, yeah. They stood with that for a moment, both of them looking at the small glass vase and the living sprig in it and the water that was clear and not stagnant. Dutch had gone to the fireplace and was lying down in front of it with his chin on his paws. He had, as of this moment, made his position clear. Mira looked around the main room, looked at the shelves at the dust on them. Not recent dust, long-settled dust. The dust of a place that had not been regularly occupied for a while, but the vase was fresh, which meant someone came here without living here, which meant someone was maintaining this without being the person who maintained everything else. She went to the nearest interior door, the workshop. A long work table against the cave wall, solid wood worn smooth in the center. Tools hung on pegs above it, in a system, each peg with a faint outline of the tool that belonged there drawn in pencil on the wall behind it. Chisels and planes and a handsaw and a small draw knife and things she didn't have words for. On the shelves along the right side, wooden boxes labeled in a handwriting she didn't recognize. And at the back of the table, a flat ledger. She went to it, opened it. Maintenance log. Dated entries going back years. The most recent entry was in different ink, newer looking. VS fall check complete. Growing room water channel clear. Firewood dry. Some shelving and vault needs replacing marked with red ribbon. Held off on window repair, ran out of time. Left fresh herbs on table and case. She read the last part again. Left fresh herbs on table and case. In case someone came. She went back to the main room. Luca was standing by the door to the third opening, the one she hadn't been able to see into from across the chamber. The one further back. He said, Mira, come look at this. His voice was different, not alarmed, something more careful than alarmed. She crossed to him. The opening led into a second, smaller chamber. Round, lower ceiling, and cooler than the main cave, the temperature dropping by several degrees as she stepped through. The smell in here was completely different. Damp earth and vegetation, and something she'd smelled before only in greenhouses. Living things growing in low light. She aimed the flashlight at the walls. Shelves. Floor-to-ceiling shelves built into the cave rock, smooth and fitted precisely. And on the shelves, containers. Ceramic pots and glass jars and clay vessels, each one sealed, each one labeled. She moved the flashlight along a row. The labels were small, white paper, handwritten. She stepped closer. Calendula officinalis, harvest, 2021, lot 47. Borago officinalis, harvest, 2019 lot, 23, replace 2024. Sanguisorba, minor harvest, 2022, lot 61. She moved the light along more. Anethum graveolens, harvest, 2023. Levisticum officinale, harvest 2020 lot, 18 from mother plant 7. She counted 3 shelves, 4, 5, going all the way around the curved wall, maybe 40 pots on each shelf, maybe 5 or 6 shelves high. She stopped counting. She said how many. Luca was already doing the math. She could tell by the particular silence he went into when he was counting. He said, this section here, just what I can see from here, I'm counting maybe 200 pots. But there's another section behind that partition. She moved the flashlight to the right, a wooden partition half height, creating a smaller alcove within the vault room. She walked to it and looked over. More shelves, a different system here. The pots were smaller, the labels were older. The ink had gone from black to brown. The handwriting was different from the outer labels, more formal, more deliberate. She picked up the nearest one carefully. The label read, Valeriana officinalis, 1962, preserved dry. Seed line from 1941. For renewal. She put it back. She picked up another. Oreganum vulgare, 1971, lot 4. Original strain. Mother plant growing room. She kept moving along the inner shelves. The dates got older. 1958, 1949, 1943. And then at the far end of the inner alcove, a cluster of containers that were different from the others. Larger. Sealed more carefully, the lids waxed. The labels in the oldest handwriting she'd seen yet. The ink so faded she had to get close to read. She brought the flashlight to within a few inches. Lobelia inflata, preserved 1931. Last renewal, 1928. Mother plant growing room keep. She moved to the next one. Symphytum officinala from the original planting, 1921. Renewed 1929 and 1937 from mother plant. Continuous line. She stood up. She looked at the labels and the pots and the shelves going around the entire curved wall, and she thought, this is not a collection. A collection was someone buying things they liked and putting them together. This was something else. This was a system. Someone had been renewing these seeds from living mother plants, tracking lineages, maintaining continuous lines. For decades. The oldest label she could find was from 1921. The newest was from last year. 100 years of this. Luca said, Mira, over here. He had moved to the far corner of the inner alcove, to the end of the last shelf, to a small section that was set apart from the others by a small strip of different colored wood along the shelf edge, darker, marking it as distinct. The containers in this section were different again. Not ceramic, not glass. Small clay vessels, hand-thrown, each one sealed with cork and wax. Maybe 20 of them. Arranged in a specific order she couldn't immediately decode. Each label was in the same handwriting as the oldest sections, the earliest. She read the first one. Achillea millefolium, original stock, 1892. She paused. To whoever tends this after me. She read it again. To whoever tends this after me. She moved to the next label. Hypericum perforatum, original, 1889. Renewed 1902, 1918, 1927. And then she stopped. Because the next label had something different at the end. Melissa officinalis, 1891. Renewed from mother plant by E. Vane, 1908 and 1922. Passed to son, 1931. This one is for coming home. She stood very still. Vane, she said quietly. Luca. He said, I see it. She moved along the row. Every label in this section had the same initials at the end. Vane, 1892. Vane, 1897. Vane. Her name was Mira Vane. She put her hand against the cave wall. The stone was cold and solid and real. She said, this is... She stopped. She said, our name is Vane. Luca said, I know. She said, that's not common. Luca said, I know. She said, that's not... She stopped again. Luca said, open B's journal. She looked at him. He said, you've been carrying it for 3 days. Open it. She'd been carrying it since the morning after her grandmother died. She'd taken it from the drawer and put it in her pack without opening it. And she had not opened it not once in 3 weeks of grief and logistics, in the particular busy hell of being someone's only surviving family when they died without a will. She'd carried it like a talisman, like something that would still be true when she was ready for it. She hadn't been ready. She wasn't sure she was ready now. Luca was looking at her with their grandmother's eyes. She took out the journal. It was small and green, and the cover was worn soft at the corners, and the spine had a crack that had been there as long as she could remember, as if the book had been opened too many times to count, and the spine had finally given up pretending to be surprised. She opened it. The first page. Her grandmother's handwriting in the slightly left-tilted script that had labeled everything in her house, every jar in every cabinet, every plant in every garden. My grandmother told me the veins came from somewhere specific. She never said where. She said the name felt more like a place than a family, like the name was trying to tell us something about where we were supposed to be. I never knew what she meant. I've spent my whole life not knowing what she meant. Mira read that twice. She read it a third time. She looked up at Luca. He said, the labels. She said, I know. He said, Vane. She said, I know. He said, Emmeline, maybe, or Eleanor. Could be a lot of names. She said, yeah. She said, could be a coincidence. Luca looked around the vault room, at the shelves going all the way to the ceiling, at the 200-plus containers and the older ones in the inner alcove, and the even older clay vessels in the marked section with the labels in the oldest handwriting. He said, do you actually think it's a coincidence? She looked at the small clay vessel, at the label that said Vane in ink that had gone brown with age. She said no. She didn't sleep well that night. She slept because she was exhausted in the accumulated way of someone who had not properly slept in 3 weeks. But it was not the sleep of a person whose mind had stopped. It was the sleep of a person whose mind was organizing information. The kind of sleep that was less rest and more processing. Luca slept properly. He was 11 years old, and he had done everything asked of him in the past 3 weeks with the composed reliability of someone twice his age, and his body apparently required approximately 9 hours of unconsciousness to continue doing that. He was asleep within 20 minutes of them eating their dinner, which was crackers and peanut butter eaten from the wrapper, because there was no other option yet, and he slept on his side under the blanket they'd found in a wooden chest near the bedroom, and he did not move until morning. Dutch slept against his feet. She sat by the cold fireplace for a long time. She had the journal open on her knee. She'd read the first page, the part about the veins. She'd read it several times now, and each time it did the same thing to her chest, which was a kind of pressure that was not quite grief and not quite excitement, but lived in the space between them. She turned pages. Her grandmother had been a botanist. Not professionally. She'd never had the degree, the funding, the institutional affiliation. But she'd had the knowledge and the dedication in the 40 years of careful observation and record-keeping that most professionals never achieved. And she'd kept this journal for most of her adult life, filling it with notes on every plant she grew, and every plant she studied, and every plant she could not identify. The journal was mostly that. Pages of careful notes, small drawings, observations on growth habit and leaf shape, and the particular way a flower opened in the morning and closed at night. But threaded through the botanical notes were other things. Personal things. things her grandmother had thought while she was observing. April 14th. The comfrey is coming back. It always comes back. I think there's a lesson in that, but I'm too tired to find it today. September 3rd. Found an old variety of calendula at the market. Someone's grandmother sold it. Bought all of them. The woman looked at me like I was odd. I didn't explain. Some things you can't explain to people who haven't spent their life looking for them. And then on a page near the middle of the journal, a longer entry. Undated. Written at a different time than the surrounding pages, the ink slightly different, the handwriting slightly smaller, as if she'd been trying to fit something important into the space available. My mother told me that her mother told her that the Vanes knew about a plant that she called the grief tender. It sounds like a folk name, a made-up thing, something out of an old wives' tale. But my mother said her grandmother was specific about it, not a metaphor, an actual plant. She said her grandmother described the leaves and the growth habit, said it wasn't dramatic looking, said you wouldn't pick it out of a garden if you didn't know what you were looking for. She said the plant was used for what she called sorrow without a name, not grief with a cause, not the sorrow of a specific loss, the deeper kind, the kind you carry for years without knowing why, the kind that sits behind your sternum and doesn't lift no matter what you do to try to lift it. I've spent 40 years looking for it. Every botanical description I can piece together from what my mother remembered from what her grandmother described. I've cross-referenced every heirloom catalog I can find. I've asked every old gardener I've met. I've written to seed preservation societies. Nothing. Either I have the wrong description, or the plant no longer exists in any accessible form, or the grief tender, if it was ever real, is gone. I found a plant recently that might be a candidate. The botanical description is close, but I can't source it anywhere. The one place it seemed to come from no longer exists as a functioning operation. I tracked the seed line as far as I could and then lost it somewhere around 1940. I think this is the end of the road for this particular search. Mira read that entry twice. Then she got up. She went back to the vault room. She moved through it, slowly sweeping her flashlight over each shelf, past the labeled rows, past the inner alcove, to the back section with the clay vessels and the E-vein labels and the oldest handwriting. She found the one she was looking for. She didn't know how she knew which one. She'd read all the labels in this section earlier. None of them had said grief tender. None of them had said anything that directly mapped to her grandmother's description. But there was one, a clay vessel smaller than the others, pushed slightly back on the shelf, its cork and wax seal intact. The label was in the oldest handwriting, but the ink was darker than the others in this section, as if it had been written later, or written with more care, or both. She held the flashlight close. Melancholia officinale, name in common, grief tender, not in any current catalog. Mother plant in growing room. Renewal 1923-1931. Last renewal 1931. She stopped breathing. She said it again in her head, not in any current catalog. She looked at the container in her hands, the wax seal unbroken, the cork intact, the label in the same handwriting as every other E-vein label. She went to the growing room. She hadn't fully explored it yet. She'd seen it earlier, had registered the lower temperature and the moisture and the smell of living things, but she hadn't gone in properly. She went in now. The growing room was behind the vault, accessed through a low opening in the back cave wall. The temperature here was different again from the vault, several degrees warmer, the humidity noticeable against her skin. The cave ceiling in this section was lower and irregular, with cracks and fissures running through it, and from somewhere above she could hear the faint movement of water. A natural spring somewhere in the rock, moving through the stone and keeping the space temperate. The floor had been modified. Stone troughs built along the walls packed with soil. Not wild, cultivated. Rows of plants growing in the trough soil with the organized patience of things that had been growing in this specific place for a long time. She moved her flashlight slowly. Most of the plants she could identify from her grandmother's journal. comfrey with its broad, hairy leaves. Valerian, a dense patch of what she was almost sure was sweet Sicily. Lovage taller than the others. And in the far corner of the room, growing in a low trough against the wall, a plant she did not recognize. Small, not dramatic looking. Slightly gray-green leaves, the edges finely toothed, the growth habit compact and dense. No flowers at this time of year. But the plant itself was clearly alive and clearly established, the soil around its base rich and dark, as if it had been feeding here for a long time. She crouched in front of it. She held the flashlight close. She looked at the leaves. She thought about the description in her grandmother's journal. The one she'd read so many times she had it memorized. The botanical description her grandmother had pieced together from what her mother remembered from what her grandmother had described. She was not a botanist. She didn't have the technical vocabulary. She could not have said standing in that growing room whether this was definitively the plant her grandmother had been looking for. But her hands were shaking, not dramatically, just slightly. The way hands shook when a body understood something a fraction of a second before the mind caught up. She sat back on her heels. She pressed one hand flat against the cool earth of the trough. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. Not yet. Not until she knew more. Not until she could confirm anything beyond this specific trembling in her chest that might have been coincidence or might have been something else entirely. She went back to the main room. Dutch was awake now. He was sitting up watching the vault doorway, watching her come back through it. He put his head to one side and regarded her with the attentiveness he gave to things he considered significant. She sat down in the chair nearest the fireplace. She looked at the empty grate. She thought about her grandmother lying in a rented hospital bed in the living room of a house that no longer belonged to them, holding her hand saying, "I never found it. I looked for it my whole life, and I never found it." She thought about the label on the clay vessel. She thought about E. Vane. She thought about the first page of the journal. The Vanes, the name feeling more like a place than a family. She thought, what are the actual odds? She thought, what are the actual realistic, mathematically considered odds that a family named Vane with a botanical history and a connection to a specific plant would end up after 3 days walking in the rain with nowhere to go in a cave in Washington state that contained that exact plant in a living state maintained by a continuous cultivation line that went back over a century. She stared at the fireplace. Very small, she said to herself, are those odds. And then unless this is exactly where they were supposed to end up, unless this is what her grandmother's name meant when it felt more like a place than a family, unless Eve Vane, whoever she was, built this place and maintained this plant and sealed it in a clay vessel and left a label on it and kept the mother plant growing and passed the renewal responsibility down through whoever came after her. And all of that happened so that eventually a girl named Mira Vane would walk in out of the rain and find it. Dutch put his chin on her knee. She put her hand on his head. She sat in the dark and she didn't sleep, and she thought about all of it. In the morning, Luca made a list. He did this the way he did everything, quietly and completely, with a sheet of paper torn from the back of his own notebook and a pencil that had been in his jacket pocket since school let out and hadn't been sharpened since September. He sat at the table in the main room and wrote down everything they needed to figure out, and he numbered the items, and when he was done, he handed it to her. 1. Water source. Not for drinking. We have the canteens. Where does the water go after need to map the channel? 2. Food beyond what we brought. What's edible in the growing room? What's edible outside? 3. Firewood. The fireplace works. I checked the flue. We need dry wood. 4. The vault. Who made it? When the E. Vane labels, the renewal dates, where does the maintenance log begin? 5. VS, who is VS? They were here recently. They'll come back. What do we say? She read the list. She said, you slept 9 hours and woke up and immediately made a logistics list. Lucas said, B used to say, the first thing you do in an uncertain situation is gather information before you make decisions. She said, she did say that. He said, so that's the list. She handed it back to him. She said, the maintenance log in the workshop. VS logged the most recent entry. The log might go back further. He said, I'll read it. She said, the growing room has plants we can eat. I saw comfrey and lovage and I think sweet Sicily, but I need to check against the journal. We don't eat anything I haven't confirmed. He said, okay. She said, for wood we have to go outside. There's dead fall on the forest floor. We just need to find pieces that haven't soaked through. He said, okay. He paused. He said, what about number 5? She said, verses. He said, they'll come back. She said, yeah. He said, what do we do? She thought about the maintenance log entry. VS fall check complete. Left fresh herbs on table in case. The matter-of-factness of that. The way it read like someone who came here regularly alone to do work that needed doing. Not someone who treated this place like property. Someone who treated it like a responsibility. She said, we keep the place exactly as we found it. We don't break anything. We don't take anything we don't need. And when VS comes back, we tell the truth. Luca said, which is, she said that we had nowhere to go and that the name on the labels in the vault is our name. Luca was quiet for a moment. Then he said, do you think VS knows about that? She said, I don't know. He said, do you think VS will care? She looked at the door of the vault room, at the dark opening of it, at the knowledge of what was in there, the careful rows of labeled containers and the old clay vessels with their brown inked labels, and the growing room with its regulated microclimate and its living plants. She said, somebody has been maintaining this for 100 years. Somebody has been renewing the seed stock and tending the growing room and coming up here alone to check the water channels and fix the shelving. She said, that's not the behavior of someone who doesn't care. Luca nodded. He said, okay. He got up. He said, I'll start with the maintenance log. She said, I'll go look for dry wood. She picked up her pack to pull out her water bottle. The journal was in the pack, the plastic bag she'd kept it in. She took it out and held it for a moment. She thought about her grandmother, about 40 years of looking, about the very last thing she'd said. She put the journal in her jacket pocket instead of her pack. Closer, easier to reach. She said to Dutch, come on. He was at the door before she'd finished the sentence. She went outside into the gray October morning, into the forest that smelled of wet pine and cold stone, and she found dry wood in the sheltered hollow of a fallen cedar where the rain hadn't reached, and she carried it back in armload by armload until she had enough stacked on the porch to last several days, and she thought about names the whole time, about the way a name could feel more like a place than a family, about what it meant to come home to somewhere you'd never been, about the thing her grandmother had spent 40 years looking for. She thought about all of it, and she didn't have answers, and she didn't try to force them. She just carried wood and listened to the rain diminish to almost nothing and watched Dutch move through the trees with the steady confidence of an animal who had arrived where he intended to be. By noon, the fire was going. By early afternoon, Luca had read the entire maintenance log and had filled 3 pages of his notebook with dates and names and observations. By evening, they had eaten. Real food, lovage soup and dried rose hips from a jar in the kitchen cabinet. The taste of it, startling after days of crackers, and a piece of flatbread Mira made from the flour she'd found in a sealed tin, and the water from the channel in the growing room, which came out slightly denser than flatbread was supposed to be, but was warm and real. Luca ate his with the concentration he gave to all food. He said the log goes back to 1948. VS starts appearing in 1987. Before that, it's different initials. G for a long time, then MG, then RG. She said all female probably. The G names, he said maybe. They don't explain themselves, just log the work. She said, what does the oldest entry say? He opened his notebook and read. He said, just vault clear, growing room good, mother plants all accounted for. But on the inside front cover, different handwriting. Older, it says, this log is for the people who come after. The work is ongoing. The work is the point. Mira was quiet. The fire did what fires did. Dutch was on his side in front of it, asleep, completely at peace, in the way of animals who had finished evaluating a situation and found it acceptable. Luca said VS has been coming here since 1987, 37 years. She said alone. He said the entries are all first-person singular, never mentions anyone else. She said, that's a long time to do something alone. He said, yeah. They sat with that. The fire shifted. A log settled. She put her hand on her jacket pocket where the journal was. She could feel the shape of it, small and green and full of her grandmother's handwriting, and 40 years of looking for something that had been growing in a cave at the back of a vault she'd never known existed. Lucas said, do you think VS knows about Elaine? She said, I've been thinking about that all day. He said, she said, VS has been coming here since 1987. That's before we were born. Whoever VS is, they've been tending this place their entire adult life. She said nobody does that without knowing what they're tending. Luca thought about that. He said, so they know. She said, I think so. He said, then when they come back, she said, we tell the truth. He said, and if they don't believe us, she said, then we show them the journal. She took it out of her pocket. She set it on the table. She looked at the green cloth cover and the cracked spine. She said B kept this for her whole life. She was looking for something in here. She wrote about our name in here. She wrote about the grief tender. She said whatever VS knows about this place, they should know that there are veins who have been looking too. Luca looked at the journal. He said, you think B knew about this place? She said, I think she might have known something. Something old. Something passed down. I think the knowing got thinner with each generation, and by the time it got to her, it was just a feeling. A name that felt like a place. A plant she couldn't find. A sense that there was something she was supposed to be looking for, without a map to find it by. He said, and then you ended up here. She said, we ended up here. She looked at Dutch by the fire. She said, we and Dutch ended up here. Luca said, dogs know things. She said, yeah. She picked up the journal. She opened it to the page with a long entry about the grief tender. She read the last 2 lines again. I think this is the end of the road for this particular search. She looked at the fire. She looked at the journal. She looked at the door to the vault room. She thought B. I don't think it was the end of the road. She thought I think it was just the end of your road. She thought I think this is where mine begins. She closed the journal. She put it back in her pocket. She got up to add another log to the fire. Outside the cave, the rain had stopped completely for the first time in 3 days. In the silence left by its absence, the forest made its ordinary sounds. Water dripping from leaves. A bird somewhere in the upper branches adjusting its position. The particular quiet of a place that had been keeping itself for a long time and was not surprised by the presence of someone who had finally found their way to it. Inside, the fire was warm. The second day started with a problem and ended with a mystery. The problem was food. The crackers were gone. The peanut butter was down to what clung to the inside of the jar, which Luca was addressing with a spoon, and the dedication of someone who understood that this was not optional. They had water from the channel in the growing room, which Mira had traced to a natural seep in the cave ceiling, cold and clean, moving through the rock at a rate that would never run dry. They had dried rose hips and some kind of hard-dried berry she couldn't identify yet from the jars in the kitchen cabinet. They had the knowledge from Luca's methodical reading of the maintenance log that the growing room contained edible plants. What they didn't have was certainty. She stood in the growing room with her grandmother's journal open and her flashlight on, and she went through the plants one by one. The lovage was unmistakable, large, tall. The smell when she crushed a leaf between her fingers hit her like a memory. Her grandmother's kitchen, a pot of something steam. The journal confirmed it, and she confirmed the journal, and she said okay to lovage. Comfrey was more complicated. The leaves were edible technically, young leaves, cooked. The journal noted the distinction with the precision of someone who knew that the distinction mattered. She found young growth at the base of the established plants, and she marked that acceptable with a mental asterisk. The sweet Sicily was fine. She'd been right about it. Anise flavored, every part edible, the journal enthusiastic about it in a way that made her think her grandmother had liked it particularly. The plant in the far corner she did not touch. She wasn't ready to touch it yet. She harvested what she'd cleared, filled her container with lovage and Sicily and young comfrey, carried it back to the kitchen. Luca had the fire going. He had laid it with the efficiency of someone who'd been watching Mira lay fires for 3 days and had internalized the method without being taught it directly. She said, "Nice fire." He said, "You do it the same way every time." She said, "Because it works every time." He said, "That's what I figured." She made soup. Lovage and Sicily in hot water with dried rose hips for acidity and a pinch of salt from the small ceramic container she'd found in the kitchen cabinet. It was not a recipe, it was an approximation of one. But it was hot and real, and it had actual nutritional content. And when she handed Luca a bowl, he drank from it without pausing and then held the bowl out for more. That was good enough. After breakfast, she said, "Weaving room today." Luca looked up. She said, "I saw it when we came in." "I haven't gone in properly." He said, "I'll keep reading the log." She said, "You've already read it." He said, "There are sections I want to reread." She said, "Which sections?" He said, "The ones from the 40s and 50s, before verses, when it was just the initial G. I want to understand the transition." He was 11 years old and he had decided to understand the archival history of a seed vault in a cave in Washington state. She was not going to argue with that. She said, "All right." She went to the weaving room. It was on the left side of the main cave, accessed through a low doorway that required her to duck slightly. She'd seen it from the main room and registered it as a room with equipment. She hadn't gone in. Now she did. The room was larger than it looked from outside. Lower ceiling maybe 6 feet, but generous in the other two dimensions. The cave walls had been smoothed here, the rough stone worked down to an almost even surface that had then been plastered over in several places. And on the plaster, someone had built wooden shelving that ran along 2 complete walls. The shelves held thread, spools and skeins and small tied bundles in more colors than she'd expected, deep reds and indigo, and a warm yellow-brown that was probably walnut and gray-greens, and the particular off-white of undyed wool. Not uniform, not a store inventory. The collection of someone who dyed things themselves batch by batch over years. And in the center of the room, the loom, floor-mounted, large, the kind she'd seen in museums but never up close. The warp threads were still strung, still under tension, still holding the beginning of an unfinished piece. She crouched and looked at the work that was already woven. About 18 inches of it, the weft threads laid in and beaten down a pattern developing in the lower section. A geometric pattern, regular, repeating. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at the walls. The weavings hung there the way art hung in galleries, each one mounted on a wooden rod, each one a complete piece. Some large, some small, some dense and heavy, clearly meant for warmth. Some lighter, more open, clearly decorative. But all of them with the same quality. Not the uniformity of machine production. The slight variations of handwork, the proof that a person had made each inch of them. She walked along the wall. She counted. 22 pieces, 22 complete weavings hung in rows. The oldest ones near the far wall, the colors faded to softer versions of what they'd been. The newer ones near the door, the colors still present. She stopped at the second to last piece on the wall. The pattern. She'd seen this before. She turned away from the wall. She went back to the main room and she dug through her pack until she found the quilt. She'd kept it rolled tight, secured against the outside of her pack, where it wouldn't crush but would stay dry under the pack cover. She unrolled it carefully. The quilt was old, very old. The cotton batting inside had compressed over decades to something thinner than it was meant to be. The outer fabric was worn soft-pilled at the places that received the most contact but intact. Her grandmother had made this, or received it, or both. She brought it back to the weaving room. She spread it on the floor next to the wall hanging. She stood up and looked at both of them. The geometric pattern in the lower left corner of the quilt. The geometric pattern throughout the wall hanging. Identical. Not similar. Not in the same tradition. Not inspired by the same influence. Identical. Down to the order of the color changes. Down to the specific diagonal accent in every third repeat that was not typical of any pattern she knew well enough to name. Down to the slight irregularity in the fourth row that repeated identically in both pieces, the one place where the pattern broke its own rule and then corrected. The same hand, the same person had made this corner of the quilt and the whole of this wall hanging. The quilt had come from here. She sat down on the cave floor next to the two pieces. She put her hand on the quilt, on the worn cotton, on the faded colors that had been brighter once. Her grandmother had carried this quilt for decades, had put it on every bed she'd ever owned, had wrapped Mira and Luca in it when they were sick, had brought it to the hospital room when she was dying. It had been on her bed when she died. It had come from this room. Someone in this cave had made it and sent it out. And the note on the vault label was still in her head. This one is for coming home. She sat on the floor of the weaving room for a long time. Dutch found her there eventually. He'd been outside doing his morning patrol of the cave entrance, but he found her the way he always found people, with the reliable accuracy of an animal who monitored locations of family members, the way other creatures monitored weather. He came in and looked at her on the floor and looked at the two textile pieces and then lay down beside her with his back pressed against her leg. She put her hand on his side. She said very quietly, "B." She wasn't talking to Dutch. She said, "I think you knew." Not completely, but you knew some of it. I think the knowing was in you the way the name was in you. Not clear enough to follow. Just present. Just there, like something you'd heard in another room. Dutch breathed. The fire in the main room made the small sounds of a fire doing its job. She said, "I'm going to find out the rest." She got up. She went back to the main room. She said, "Luca." He was at the table, 3 pages of notes in front of him. He looked up. She said, "Look at this." She spread the quilt on the table. She said, "Come to the weaving room." He followed her. She showed him the quilt side by side with the wall hanging. He looked at both of them. He said nothing for a moment. Then the irregularity in the fourth row. She said, "Same in both." He said, "That's not a pattern you'd repeat accidentally." She said, "No." He said, "Someone sent this quilt out of here." She said, "Yes." He said, "For us." She said, "For someone named Vane, someone who would need to come home." He looked at the wall hanging, at the faded colors of the quilt, at the wooden rod the hanging was mounted on, and the careful loops of thread that attached it. He said slowly, "B had this her whole life." She said, "Her whole life that we know of. It might have been in the family before her." He said, "She never told you." She said, "She told me things in other ways. She wrote about the name feeling like a place. She wrote about looking for the grief tender. She carried this quilt everywhere. Maybe the telling was in the carrying." Luca was quiet. He said the maintenance log, the initials G in the early years, and then MG, and then RG, and then VS starting in 1987. She said same commitment across 4 generations. He said VS is the current one. She said VS was here last week. He said, "So they're coming back?" She said, "Yes." He looked at the quilt again. He said, "When they come back, they'll see this." She said, "That's the idea." He said, "You want them to see us with the quilt." She said, "I want them to know everything all at once, so we don't have to try to convince anyone of anything. So the thing speaks for itself." Luca nodded slowly. He said, "Okay." He went back to his notes. She stayed in the weaving room. She sat in the low wooden chair beside the loom, and she looked at the unfinished work on it. The 18 inches of completed weaving, the pattern that had been building in the lower section and then stopped, the 2 shuttles resting on the warp still threaded waiting. Whoever had left this had planned to come back. They left it mid-work, not abandoned it. Left it. There's a difference. She thought about what it took to maintain a place for 37 years alone, to come up here year after year checking the water channels and replacing the shelving and leaving fresh herbs on a table just in case. To keep doing that without knowing if anyone was ever coming. She thought that's not caretaking. That's faith. She stayed in the weaving room until the afternoon light changed. Then she went fishing. She found the stream by following the water sound down the slope below the cave entrance, moving through forest that had dried out in the previous day's break from rain, but was already developing the soft soil smell that meant rain was coming again. The stream was 20 minutes down, shallow, clear, running over round stones. Fish. She saw them before she heard them. 3 or 4 shapes hanging in the current behind a flat stone fins, moving in the small adjustments that kept them in place. She went back to the workshop for the fishing line she'd found coiled on a peg. It took a while. The first fish got away because she pulled too early. The second got away for the same reason. She made herself wait. The third one she felt before she saw it. The line went different. She waited 1 more second, and then she pulled, and the flash of silver breaking the surface was so startling, she almost dropped the line. She didn't drop the line. She caught it. She caught 3 total before she went back up the slope. The light was getting low. She cleaned them at the edge of the stream the way her grandmother had shown her, and she carried them back wrapped in a flat piece of bark, and she felt for the first time in almost a month like a person who was doing something real. Luca had soup started when she got back. He'd expanded the recipe, found dried mushrooms somewhere in the kitchen cabinets, and had added those and found a jar of dried onion that was old enough to have lost its potency, but still gave something to the water. He'd done all this by himself while she was gone. She held up the fish. He said, "Oh." She said, "3." He said, "We can do those over the fire." She said, "Yeah." He said, "Actual fish." She said, "Actual fish." He was quiet for a moment. He said B would say we were doing all right. She said, "We are doing all right." He said, "Are we?" She said, "We have shelter and water and food and a fire. That's doing all right." He considered that. He said, "What about VS?" She said, "We keep being honest. We do the work. We don't take more than we need. And we wait." He said, "What if they say we have to go?" She said, "Then we have more information than we had when we got here, and we figure out the next thing from there." He was quiet. "Then the quilt." She said, "Yeah." He said, "You really think it'll matter to them?" She said, "I think if someone has been coming to this place alone for 37 years, they're doing it because they believe the place matters. And if the place matters to them the way it matters, then they're not going to look at a girl named Vane holding a quilt woven by the same hands that built this room and feel nothing." Luca looked at the fire. He said, "That's a lot of hope to put in a quilt." She said, "It's not hope. It's evidence." He nodded. They cooked the fish over the fire one at a time on a flat stone she'd found near the back of the cave, and they ate them with the soup and the last of the dried rose hips, and it was the best meal she'd had in a month. That night she slept well. She woke on the third morning to Dutch standing in the middle of the main room. Not at the door, not at his usual spot. In the middle of the room, facing the direction of the cave entrance, ears forward, tail not moving. She sat up. She said, "Dutch." He didn't look at her. She said, "Someone's coming." Not a question. She got up. She got Luca up. She folded the quilt and held it in her arms. She stood in the main room with Luca beside her and Dutch in front of both of them, and she waited. The sound of boots on stone, slow, deliberate. The sound of someone who knew this ground well and was moving carefully because their body required it. A figure came through the gap in the roots, old, tall but folded forward slightly by time. White hair cut short and practical. A waxed jacket that had been good quality once and had been worn enough to become something better than good quality. A wooden walking stick, the kind that had been cut for purpose, not bought. She moved with the particular economy of someone who had been managing limited mobility for long enough to have become expert at it. She came through the gap and stood up straight and looked at the cave. Then she looked at Mira. Then she looked at Dutch. Then she looked at the quilt in Mira's arms. She stopped moving. Completely. Not surprise stopped. Confirmation stopped. The stop of someone whose mind has just finished processing something it already suspected. Mira said, I know this isn't our place. The woman said nothing. Mira said, we've been here 3 days. We've taken what we needed, and we've been careful. We haven't disturbed anything in the vault. We haven't damaged anything in the weaving room. The woman looked at the quilt. She said, and her voice was lower than Mira had expected, deliberate. Where did you get that? Mira said. It was my grandmother's. She had it her whole life. The woman said, your grandmother. She said her name was Beatrice Vane. Something happened in the woman's face. Not dramatic, just a settling, like something that had been held at a slight tension for a long time was allowed to release a fraction. She said, sit down. It was not a question. They sat. The woman lowered herself into the chair at the head of the table with the care of someone who had done the calculation of how to sit without pain many times and had arrived at a reliable method. She put the walking stick across her knees. She looked at Mira. She said, my name is Vesta Shorn. I've been maintaining this compound since 1987. Mira said, I read the maintenance log. Vesta said, I know. I could see which entries you touched. Mira said, I didn't damage anything. Vesta said, I know that too. A pause. Luca said, VS. Vesta looked at him. He said, that's you in the log. VS. She said, yes. He said, before you, it was RG, and before that, MG, and before that, just G. She said, my mother, my grandmother, and before her, a woman named Gracie who was a neighbor Emmeline trusted. She passed the responsibility to my grandmother when her health declined. Luca said, why did they do it? Your family. Vesta looked at him the way adults sometimes looked at children who asked the question everyone else was dancing around. She said, because someone built it, and someone has to tend it. Luca said, who built it? Vesta said, her name was Emmeline Vane. She started construction in 1889. She finished the vault in 1901. The growing room was last 1912. She lived here from 1889 until she died here in 1948. Mira said she never left. Vesta said she left when she needed to. But this was her home, her real home. She looked at the quilt in Mira's arms. She said she sent that out in 1931 with a letter to her daughter who had already left by then. The letter said she stopped. She said, I have a copy of the letter in the files in the workshop. I'll show you. But the gist of it was what you might expect. She said that if the family ever lost their way back to themselves, this place would still be here, and that the quilt would help them know it when they found it. Mira looked down at the quilt. She said, my grandmother never knew about this place. Vesta said, not consciously, but she kept the quilt, and she kept looking. Mira said, for the grief tender. Vesta went very still. Mira said she wrote about it in her journal. A plant she called the grief tender. She looked for it her whole life. Vesta said, where did you see that name? Mira said, in the vault, the back section, the clay vessels. One of them has a label, Melancholia officinale. The common name on the label is grief tender. Vesta said nothing for a moment. Then you found that shelf. Mira said, my brother found it. He noticed the section was different from the others. Vesta looked at Luca. Luca said, the shelf edge has a different colored wood. It marks it as distinct. Vesta said Emmeline's original planting notes. She marked that section for the plant that she said was the reason she built the vault in the first place. Mira said, is it still alive? The mother plant. Vesta said, it's in the growing room. It's been there since 1889. We've never let it go dormant. Mira said, and her voice was very even because she was working to keep it very even. My grandmother spent 40 years looking for that plant. Vesta said, I know. Mira said she never found it. Vesta said, she couldn't have found it. It doesn't exist outside this cave. Emmeline deliberately kept it here. She said she'd watched what happened when knowledge like that got into commercial hands. She said she'd rather keep it alive for one family than scatter it to everyone and watch it become nothing. Mira said her family. Vesta said her family. The fire settled. Lucas said carefully, "You've been maintaining this for 37 years, for a family you'd never met." Vesta said, "My grandmother maintained it before me, and her before that. We're not Vanes. We have no claim to this place." But Emmeline asked Gracie to tend it. The debt passed down, and we said yes to it every generation. Lucas said, "Why?" Vesta said, "Because the place deserved tending. And because—" She stopped. She looked at the quilt. She said, "Because my family owed a debt to Emmeline Vane. A personal debt. The kind you pay by doing what someone asked you to do." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Mira held the quilt. She thought about 37 years of coming here alone, about the maintenance log, about the entry that said "left fresh herbs on table in case," about a woman who was 72 years old and had come here alone in October after an illness that had clearly cost her something, to check the water channels and replace the shelving and leave herbs for someone who might not come. She said, "The letter you mentioned, the one from Emmeline to her daughter." Vesta said yes. She said, "Can I read it?" Vesta looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "That's why I brought it." She reached into the inside pocket of her wax jacket and produced an envelope. Old. The paper of it gone from white to a deep cream. She held it out. Mira took it. She opened it carefully. The letter inside was 2 pages written on the same kind of paper as the envelope, the handwriting the same as the labels in the vault. Smaller than she'd imagined. More precise. The hand of someone who measured their words because they'd learned over a long life that words had weight. She read, "My daughter, I know you will not come back here. I know this is a place you couldn't stay, and I am not angry about that. You needed more room than this cave could give you. I have always known that. I built this place for the children who would stay, and you were not one of them, and that is all right. But somewhere ahead there will be a child who needs what's here. I can't see which one. I can't see their face. I just know the pattern repeats. Our kind always finds its way back, eventually. The grief we carry, the particular kind that has no single cause, the kind that just lives in us like a low note. We were born knowing it tends to come back around. And when it comes back around, they will need what I've kept. Send the quilt out. Keep it in the family. Tell them it's from me. They won't know who I am, but the quilt will tell them when they need telling. The plant they need is in the growing room. The clay vessel in the vault has documentation. I've written down everything I know about preparation and use. I didn't come to this knowledge easily, and I don't give it away lightly. But it belongs to the family. Always did. I want to say something about the grief tender specifically, because I've watched people misunderstand it their whole lives. It doesn't take grief away. Nothing does. Grief is information. The grief tender works on the nameless kind, the kind that isn't grief at all, but gets called that because we don't have a better word for it. The weight that lives behind the sternum for no reason you can name. The heaviness that some people carry from birth, and some people acquire, and some people die, not knowing wasn't permanent. It isn't permanent. That's what I want whoever finds this to know. It isn't permanent. The plan is real. The work is real. And they will be all right, with love across whatever distance there is between us. Emmeline Vane, 1931. Mira put the letter down on the table. She did not cry. She wanted to. She was aware of the precise location in her chest where the wanting was a specific pressure that she'd been managing for 3 weeks. But she didn't cry. She looked at the fire. She thought about her grandmother lying in the rented hospital bed saying, "I never found it. I looked for it my whole life, and I never found it." She thought about the letter in front of her, about Emmeline's careful script. She thought she had it too. B had it too. The grief that wasn't grief, the kind Emmeline wrote about. She'd had it her whole life, and she'd spent her whole life looking for the thing that had been waiting in a cave in Washington State for the entire duration of her search. Mira put her hand over her mouth, not crying, just a moment. Vesta was watching her. Luca was watching her. Dutch came and sat beside her chair. She said after a moment, she never knew. Vesta said no. She said she spent her whole life. Vesta said, I know. Silence. Then Luca said, and his voice was careful, the vault, the renewal system, the mother plant. Vesta said, yes. He said, you've been keeping it alive the whole time. She said, yes. He said, for whoever came back. She said, for whoever came back. Mira looked at Emmeline's letter, at the precise, careful script. She said, I'm 17 years old. Vesta said, I know. She said, my brother is 11. We have $61. Vesta said, I know that too. She said, we have nowhere to go. Vesta said, I know. A beat. Vesta said, I came here today to make a decision. She reached inside her jacket again. This time she produced 3 envelopes. White, modern, crisp. She set them on the table. The return address on the first one read, Veltris Corp., Research Division. Mira looked at the envelopes. She looked at Vesta. Vesta said, they found the plants growing outside the cave entrance. The runoff from the growing room has seeded some of the species into the soil around the root gap over the years. A field botanist from their research team flagged it 18 months ago. Mira said they want to buy. Vesta said the first offer was substantial. The second was more. The third came last month. She paused. She said, I'm 72 years old. I've had 2 hospitalizations this year. I cannot climb this mountain in another 2 years, maybe less. I have no children. The line that maintained this place ends with me. She looked at the envelopes. She said, if I sell to Veltris, this compound is gone. Not the cave, but everything Emmeline built, the vault, the growing room, the continuous plant lines, the weaving room. All of it becomes a resource extraction site with a research building over it. She said, I don't want that. She said, I came here today to make a decision, and I had no one to make it with. She looked at Mira. She said, and then I came through the gap and found a girl named Vane holding Emmeline's quilt. Mira looked at the envelopes, at the letter in Emmeline's handwriting, at the quilt on the table. She said, you want me to say I'll take it. Vesta said, I want you to understand what you'd be taking. She said, 40 years of seed renewal. A growing room I barely understand. A vault with 200 containers. A weaving room with 22 pieces in an unfinished work on the loom. Vesta said yes. She said, I'm 17. Vesta said Emmeline was 19 when she started. Mira looked at the table. She looked at the journal in her pocket. She said, my grandmother spent 40 years looking. Vesta said yes. She said she never got here. Vesta said no. She said, but I did. She said it quietly, not triumphantly, just stating a fact that she was still in the process of absorbing. Vesta said nothing. Luca said she'd say you were doing all right. Mira looked at her brother. He said B. She'd say you were doing all right. She thought about it. She said she'd say we were doing all right. He said yeah. He said us and Dutch. She looked at Dutch, who was sitting between them both, with the alertness of an animal who understood that something important was being decided and wanted to be accounted for in the decision. She said, us and Dutch. She looked at Vesta. She said, what does it actually require day to day? What does the work look like? Vesta said, I'll show you. She said starting when Vesta said starting now. She pushed herself up from the chair with the careful leverage of someone who'd learned to do that without making it look effortful. She said, the growing room first. The water channel is the most critical thing. If that blocks, you lose the moisture regulation and the plants die. And we need to talk about the renewal cycle for the vault. October is when you harvest for winter storage. She was already walking. Mira stood up. She looked at Luca. He had his notebook open. She said, you coming? He said, I'll be right there. I want to finish this note. She said, what are you writing? He said the date and what happened. For the maintenance log. She paused. He said someone should record it. That's what the log is for. She looked at him, at the pen in his hand, at the careful way he held it. She said, put both our names. He said M vein and L vein. Good, she said, good. She followed Vesta into the growing room. The temperature dropped slightly as she entered. The familiar smell, the sound of the water somewhere above, the rows of plants in their troughs. Vesta was already at the water channel, crouched at the near end, pointing with one finger. She said, you see where the clay has started to pull away from the stone. Mira crouched beside her. She looked at the gap, small, a hairline at the moment. But the clay was old, and the water worked on it season by season. She said, that's the weak point. Vesta said every year, same place. You pack it back with fresh clay from the bin in the corner and seal it with the compound I'll show you. If you let it go, the channel loses pressure and the far end of the room dries out. She said the far corner. Vesta said yes. She said that's where it is. Vesta went still. She said yes. Mira looked at the plant in the far corner, the one she'd crouched in front of on her first night. The slightly gray-green leaves, the compact, dense growth, the soil around it dark and rich. She said, that's the grief tender. Vesta said yes. She said, and the clay vessel in the vault, with the original documentation. Vesta said Emmeline's own notes, everything she knew about preparation, everything she'd been taught, and everything she'd figured out herself. She said it works. Vesta said, yes, she said, you know that from experience. Vesta looked at the plant. She was quiet for a moment. She said, my mother gave it to me when I was 32. I'd been carrying something for as long as I could remember. The kind that doesn't have a name. The kind that lives without cause or explanation. Like a frequency you were born tuned to that no one else seemed to hear. She said it took 3 months of treatment, the way Emmeline wrote about it. Very small doses, very consistent, very patient. She said, and then it was gone. She said, not gone like something that never existed, gone like something that finally finished, like a song ending instead of stopping. Mira looked at the plant. She thought about her grandmother. She said she never got to try it. Vesta said no. She said she carried it her whole life. And she never, Vesta said no. A long pause. Mira sat on the floor of the growing room next to the water channel with the smell of living plants around her, and the sound of water moving through stone above her head, and the pressure in her chest that had been there since before Paul's car in the driveway, and before the cleaners coming Thursday, and before the rented hospital bed, and before she could name when it had started, because she was starting to understand that it had always been there. Not grief. Something prior to grief. Something she'd been born carrying without knowing the name for it. She said very quietly, can I try it? Vesta turned to look at her. She said, you'd have to stay. Mira said, I know. She said you'd have to learn. The whole vault. The renewal cycle. The growing room maintenance. The weaving if you want to continue that work. All of it. Mira said, I know. She said it's not a short commitment. Mira looked at the plant. She said, my grandmother spent 40 years looking for this. She died 3 weeks ago not knowing it was here. She said, I'm not leaving. Vesta looked at her for a long time. Then she said, all right. She said it the same way the maintenance log said left herbs on table and case. Simply, practically. Like it was the only reasonable conclusion to reach given the available evidence. She said, let's start with the channel repair, and then I'll show you the renewal documentation in the vault. She said, we have a lot of work to do before winter. Mira stood up. She looked at the grief tender in its corner trough. She looked at the cave ceiling above it, at the cracks in the stone, where water moved through the rock in the dark, and kept this temperature and this humidity and this particular microclimate alive through every season. She thought about Emmeline building this room in 1912, working alone, knowing what she was making and why. She said, show me how to fix the channel. Vesta handed her a tool. They got to work. Vesta stayed 4 days. Not 4 days she'd planned. She'd come for one afternoon, maybe two, to do her fall check and make her decision. 4 days happened because there was too much to teach in one afternoon, and she was the kind of person who, once she decided something, did not do it by halves. On the first day, she taught Mira the water channel, the repair compound mixed in specific ratios, the way you packed it back into the gap with your thumb before sealing the outer layer, the signs that told you when the channel was running well, and the subtler signs that told you when it was thinking about not running well, which was harder to learn and more important. She said the cave has its own language. You learn it by watching, not by reading about it, not by being told. You watch and you wait, and eventually you start to hear it. Mira packed the compound into the gap the way Vesta showed her. She said, "What does it sound like when something's wrong?" Vesta said, "Wetter. The air goes wetter in the growing room before any damage shows." "That's your first warning." She said, "How much wetter?" Vesta said, "That's the part you can't be told. That's the part you'll know once you've felt it the right way and the wrong way enough times to know the difference." Mira filed that, along with everything else. On the second day, Vesta taught her the vault renewal cycle. October was harvest time for 15 of the 200-plus lines. Which 15 and why and what the harvest process looked like, and how you stored the seed for winter, and what the indicators were for seed viability, and how you cross-checked against the documentation, and what you did when you found a line that had degraded in viability and needed to be refreshed from the mother plant. Luca wrote everything down. He'd appointed himself the documentation arm of this operation without anyone suggesting it, and he sat at the work table in the vault with his notebook and his pencil and wrote in his careful 11-year-old handwriting as fast as Vesta spoke. When she moved on before he'd finished a thought, he said so, and she waited, without impatience, as if waiting for complete documentation was simply correct. She said on the afternoon of the second day, "Your brother is a good student." Mira said, "He's a better student than me." Vesta said, "You're a different kind of student. You watch. He records. You need each other." She said it the way she said most things, not as a compliment, as an assessment. On the third morning, Luca found the small vessel. She'd been in the growing room checking the far trough when she heard him. He didn't call her name. He didn't say, "Mira, come look at this." He just said, "Oh." She knew from the specific quality of his "oh" that it was important. She went back through the vault doorway. He was standing at the far end of the inner alcove, the section with the E-vein labels in the oldest handwriting. He was holding something small enough to disappear in his palm. She crossed to him. He held it out. The vessel was smaller than she'd expected, smaller than any of the others in this section, smaller than her thumb. Clay hand thrown, the cork and wax seal intact, and the label. No year, no Latin name, just handwriting, the same E-vein handwriting as all the others in this section. But the ink was darker, like it had been written more recently than the others around it, or written with more pressure, with more care. She held the flashlight close. "For the last granddaughter who comes home." She stopped breathing. Luca said, "Keep reading." She angled the flashlight. "This one only lives here now." She straightened up. She said, "That's..." She stopped. She said, "Luca." He said, "I know." She said, "That's the grief tender. That's the documentation vessel. Emmeline made a vessel specifically." She stopped. She said, "For the last granddaughter who comes home." He said, "Yeah." She said quietly, "She made this in 1931, or before. She made this for someone whose name she didn't know. She made it knowing the family had scattered, knowing she might never see a vein again. And she made this anyway, and she kept the plant alive anyway. For over 90 years, she said 90 years. He said more, actually. The mother plant was planted before 1931. The 1931 vessel is just when she made the documentation." She said, "How long has that plant been alive in there?" He looked at his notes. He said, the growing room was finished in 1912. The first reference to this specific plant in the maintenance log is 1921. Earliest renewal I can find is 1927. She said, over 100 years. He said, over 100 years. She stood in the inner alcove of the vault with a small clay vessel in her hand, and she thought about 100 years, about the weight of that, about Emmeline building the growing room and planting the grief tender and tending it, and then asking someone else to tend it after her. And that person asking someone else, and Vesta coming for 37 years alone, and the plant never once going dormant because someone kept coming back. She took the journal out of her pocket. She didn't need to flip through it. She knew the page. She'd read it enough times in the past 3 days that she had it memorized, but she needed to see it in her grandmother's actual handwriting. She needed the physical evidence of the actual words. She opened to the page. She read it out loud. She said, my mother told me that her mother told her that the Vanes knew about a plant she called the grief tender. She said the plant was used for what she called sorrow without a name, not grief with a cause, the deeper kind, the kind you carry for years without knowing why. I've spent 40 years looking for it. I tracked the seed line as far as I could and then lost it somewhere around 1940. I think this is the end of the road for this particular search. She closed the journal. She looked at the vessel in her hand. She said she tracked the seed line, and she lost it around 1940. She said because whoever held the line in 1940 didn't go to catalogs or preservation societies. They came here. She said she was looking for it in exactly the wrong direction. She was looking out in the world for something that was being kept specifically away from the world so that it would survive long enough for someone named Vane to come home. She said she spent 40 years looking in every direction except back. She put her hand over her mouth, not crying, just the specific physical sensation of understanding something too large to hold all at once. The way you had to hold it in pieces and put the pieces together slowly because trying to hold it all at once didn't work. Luca said Mira. She said, yeah. He said she knew the name. She said, what? He said, Bay. She knew what it was called, grief tender. She wrote it in the journal. She said, yeah. He said, and it's on the label. Emmeline's label. Grief tender. She said, yeah. He said, so even the name was preserved, just in two different places at the same time. She put the small clay vessel down very carefully on the shelf. She pressed her back against the cave wall. She put both hands flat on the stone behind her. Cold, solid, real. She stood there for a moment. Then she said, okay. He said, okay. She said, I know what I need to do. He said, tell me. She said, I need paper, real paper, not notebook paper, and I need to sit at the table. He said, Vesta has paper. I saw it in the workshop files. She said, get me some. She went to the main room. She sat at the table. She looked at the fire that Vesta had built this morning and was burning steadily. At Dutch by the hearth, at the weaving room doorway and the vault doorway, and all the evidence of what had been maintained here for all the years between Emmeline and now. She thought about what Vesta had said, that she'd come to make a decision and she'd had no one to make it with. She thought about Veltris Corp and their 3 envelopes and their field botanist and their research division. She thought about the grief tender in its corner trough still alive after a century of tending. She thought about the word custodian, not owner, not buyer, not developer. Custodian, the person who keeps something, not because they built it or because they paid for it, because they showed up, because the work needed doing and they were the ones who could do it. Luca came back with 3 sheets of paper. She said use as much as you need. He sat down across from her. He said, what are you writing? She said a proposal. He said to Vesta. She said to everyone, to Vesta, to Veltris, to whoever needs to read it to understand why this place can't become what they want to make it. She picked up the pen. She thought for a moment. Then she started writing. It took her an hour. She wrote it by hand because that was what was available, And because she thought a letter handwritten by someone who had been living in a cave for 4 days was harder to dismiss than a typed document from an office. She wasn't wrong about that instinct. She wrote about the vault and what it contained, not in abstract terms, in specific terms. The 200-plus seed lines, the 15 renewable lines from this October, the renewal documentation going back to 1921. She wrote about what that meant: a continuous living record of heirloom and heritage plant varieties across multiple growing seasons spanning over a century. The kind of record that seed preservation organizations spent decades trying to reconstruct from fragments. The kind that existed here intact because someone had kept coming back to renew it. She wrote about the growing room, about the natural microclimate that regulated the temperature and humidity without any intervention, about the plant lines being grown from living specimens rather than stored seed alone, about why that mattered. Living cultivation maintained genetic expression in ways that frozen storage alone could not. She wrote about what would happen if Veltris acquired the site, not as an accusation, as a factual assessment. The infrastructure Veltris would build to contain and study the cave's resources would necessarily alter the conditions that made those resources viable. The plants in the growing room depended on specific airflow and humidity levels that would not survive construction. The vault's temperature stability would be compromised by climate control systems designed for human occupancy rather than seed preservation. Within a decade of acquisition, most of what Emmeline had built over 50 years would be gone. And then she wrote about the alternative. She wrote, "The compound needs a permanent resident, not a part-time caretaker, a person who lives here and knows the systems and maintains the renewal cycle and understands the relationship between the cave's natural conditions and the life that depends on them. I am proposing to be that person." She wrote about what she was asking for. Not ownership, a formal custodianship agreement legally documented, the right to live here and maintain the compound in exchange for certain obligations. Quarterly documentation reports, annual access for non-invasive research by qualified botanical researchers, maintenance of the existing seed lines and their documentation, continuation of the weaving tradition as a cultural heritage practice. She wrote, "In exchange, I am asking Veltris Corp. to withdraw their purchase offer and to commit to a non-extraction research partnership that does not require site modification. I am asking Vesta Shorn to transfer custodial responsibility to me formally with documentation that recognizes the compound's history and its connection to the Vane family." She wrote, "I am 17 years old. I have no resources and no institutional affiliation. What I have is the name that's been on these labels since 1889 and a grandmother who spent 40 years looking for what's in this cave and a brother who has already started the botanical documentation log for this season. And I have the understanding that some things need a person to stay with them, not visit. Stay." She wrote, "I am prepared to stay." She put the pen down. She read it back. It was 3 pages, handwritten on paper borrowed from the workshop files. She handed it to Luca. He read it. He said, "You're 17. She said, "That's in the proposal." He said, "You put it in the proposal." She said, "Seemed important to be up front." He said, "Veltris Corp. has lawyers." She said, "I know." He said, "This is handwritten on workshop paper." She said, "I know." He said, "And you think this is going to work?" She said, "I think this is going to tell the truth. Whether it works depends on whether the truth is enough." He said, "And if it's not enough," she said, "then we have more information than we had 4 days ago. And we're still the people who know what's in the vault and what it's worth and that it needs someone to tend it. And we find another way." He handed the proposal back. He said, "It's good." She said, "You're 11. You can't know if it's legally good." He said, "I'm not talking about legally. I'm talking about the part where you said some things need a person to stay with them." She said, "Yeah." He said, "That part is good." She looked at the 3 pages. She said, "I need Vesta to read it." She found Vesta in the weaving room. She'd gone in after the morning's vault work, which was the 3rd time she'd been in there. She was standing at the loom, not working it, just standing at it with her hands resting on the frame, looking at the unfinished piece. Mira held out the proposal. She said, "Read this." Vesta took it. She read it standing at the loom. She didn't move while she read. She didn't react visibly to any of it. She read all 3 pages, and then she stood for a moment holding the pages. She said, "You wrote this morning." Mira said, "Yes," she said, "by hand." Mira said, "I know." She said, "Veltris has lawyers." Mira said, "I know that too." My brother pointed that out. Vesta said, "Smart boy." She said, "Smart boy." She looked at the proposal again. She said, "You put your age in it." Mira said, "Seemed important." Vesta was quiet for a moment. "Then you said you're not leaving." Mira said, "Yes." Vesta said, "I said you'd have to stay." Mira said, "Yes." She said, "This is the formal version of that conversation." Mira said, "Yes." Vesta looked at the last page. She read, "Some things need a person to stay with them, not visit, stay." She said, "Emmeline said that." Almost exactly. In the 1931 letter to her daughter, she said this place didn't need visitors. It needed keepers. Mira said, "I didn't know that." Vesta said, "I know you didn't." She set the proposal on the work table. She said, "Veltris Corp is sending someone." Mira said, "When?" Vesta said, "They told me in the last letter. They're sending a field representative to walk the site and make a formal offer." I told them November. I didn't tell them the exact date. She said so they could come any time. Vesta said, "Within the month." Mira said, "Then we need to document everything before they get here." Vesta said, "Yes." Mira said, "Luca is already writing the documentation log. We need photographs. We need a formal inventory of the vault. We need a written assessment of the growing room conditions." Vesta said, "I have a camera in my pack." She said, "Of course you do." She said, "Show me." They spent the rest of that day documenting. Vesta had a small waterproof camera she'd been bringing to the compound for years. They went through the vault methodically, every shelf, every section, every label. Luca called out the label text and dates while Mira photographed and Vesta wrote. They worked slowly enough to do it right. They did not rush. This was the kind of work that didn't have a shortcut. The growing room took longer. Every plant, every trough, the water channel, the natural seep in the ceiling, the temperature measurement Vesta made with a small thermometer from her jacket pocket, reading it twice and writing both readings. And the grief tender. Vesta spent more time photographing the grief tender than any other plant. Not because it was dramatic looking, because it wasn't. Because the plant's value was almost entirely invisible, and the documentation had to carry the weight of what wasn't visible. She said, "This is the only extant living specimen outside of Emmeline's original notes." Mira said, "There's nothing like it anywhere else." Vesta said there were related plants in 2 heritage collections in Europe before 1970. Both collections were lost, one to a fire, one to institutional funding cuts. She said, "So this is it." Vesta said, "This is it." Mira photographed the plant from above, from the side, from close enough to see the individual leaf texture. She said Emmeline made this room for it. Vesta said she made the whole compound for it. The vault supported the compound financially through the partnership she maintained. The growing room was the reason. She said a 100-year-old plant that no one outside this cave knows exists. Vesta said, "That's accurate." She said, "And if Veltris gets this site," Vesta said, "the growing room would be compromised within the first year of construction. They'd lose the microclimate. The plant would die." She said they'd try to extract it first. Vesta said, "Probably." But Emmeline's notes on propagation are extensive and specific. The plant doesn't propagate the way most plants do. It needs the specific soil composition and humidity range that exists naturally in this room. She spent 15 years getting it established. I've never tried to move it, and I never intended to. Mira looked at the plant. She said, "This has been alive longer than anyone alive today." Vesta said, "Yes." She said, "And it can't leave." Vesta said, "It can't leave." She said, "Then someone has to stay with it." Vesta didn't answer. She didn't need to. Veltris Corp arrived on the fourth morning. Not a full team. One person. A woman in her 50s with a field pack and good boots and the manner of someone who had been to a lot of unusual places and had learned not to react visibly to unusual things. She came through the root gap without assistance and stood up and looked at the cave with the professional assessment of someone cataloging what she saw. Mira was standing in the main room. The woman said, "I'm Dr. Rice, Research Partnerships Veltris Corporation. I'm here at Ms. Shorn's invitation." Mira said Ms. Shorn is in the growing room. "I'll get her." She went to get Vesta. Vesta came out of the growing room with the unhurried pace of someone who had decided how she was going to handle this and was executing that decision. She said, "Dr. Rice, come in." Dr. Rice looked at the main room, at the fire, at the table, at Luca at the work table visible through the vault doorway. She said, "You have people staying here." Vesta said, "I have the property's caretaker staying here, and her brother." Dr. Rice said, "The property doesn't have a caretaker on record." Vesta said, "It does now." A pause. Vesta said, "Sit down. We have tea." She said it like that was the agenda. Tea, then whatever came after. Dr. Rice sat. Mira made tea. She brought it to the table and she put Vesta's proposal in front of Dr. Rice without comment. Dr. Rice looked at it. She said, "This is handwritten." Mira said, "We're working with what we have." Dr. Rice read it. She read it the way Vesta had read it, without visible reaction, going through each page, setting each page down with the care of someone processing rather than dismissing. When she finished, she said, "You're 17. Mira said, "Yes." She said, "You want to live here?" Mira said, "I want to maintain the compound. Living here is required to maintain it properly." Dr. Rice said, "Why?" Mira said, "Because the growing room needs daily attention in winter. Because the vault renewal cycle runs on a schedule that requires consistent presence. Because some things need a person to stay with them." Dr. Rice looked at her. Mira said, "This compound contains the only living specimen of a plant species that hasn't existed outside this cave in over 50 years. That plant depends on a natural microclimate that would be destroyed by construction. If your company acquires this site, you'll spend significant resources trying to establish the plant in controlled conditions, and you'll fail. Because the conditions here aren't controllable. They're geological. They've taken 100 years to calibrate." Dr. Rice said, "You've been here 4 days. Mira said, "I've read 100 years of documentation, and I've been taught by the person who maintained this for 37 of them." She said, "The proposal offers Veltris non-exclusive research access. Your botanist can come here and work with what's here. You'll get more usable data from a living compound with a caretaker than from a demolished site where you're trying to recreate conditions from notes." Silence. Dr. Rice looked at Vesta. She said, "Is this what you want?" Vesta said, "This is what the compound needs." She said, "That's not what I asked." Vesta looked at Mira. She said, "This girl is named Vane. Her grandmother spent 40 years looking for this place without finding it. The plant Emmeline Vane preserved here, specifically for her family, is in the growing room right now. I've maintained this place for 37 years waiting for exactly this. So yes, this is what I want." Dr. Rice looked at the proposal. She said, "I'll need to take this back. Legal review. I can't commit on site." Mira said, "I know." She said, "You understand this is outside standard acquisition protocol." Mira said, "I know." She said, "Veltris Corp's interest in this site is significant." Mira said, "I know that too." She said, "A non-extraction partnership doesn't serve our standard research model." Mira said, "It serves the research, the plant you're interested in, the botanical lines in the vault, the documentation record. All of it stays alive and accessible under this proposal. Under an acquisition, none of it survives the construction phase. Dr. Rice was quiet. She said, "You wrote that." Mira said, "Yes." She said, "You thought that through." Mira said, "I had help." She glanced at the vault doorway. Luca was standing in it. Notebook, pencil, the expression of someone who had been listening carefully and had opinions about everything he'd heard. Dr. Rice looked at him. He said, "The vault documentation covers 100 years of continuous botanical record keeping. That's not a resource you can replace. If this site is modified, that record becomes historical rather than active. The difference between a living research resource and an archive is whether the renewal cycle continues. The renewal cycle requires a person on site." Dr. Rice looked at him for a moment. She said, "How old are you?" He said, 11. She said, "You read all of the documentation." He said, "I'm halfway through." She said, "In 4 days." He said, "I read fast." Dr. Rice said nothing for a moment. Then she picked up the proposal. She said, "I'll take this to legal. I can't promise an outcome, but I can promise it gets read by the right people." She said, "I'll need the documentation you've started, the inventory, the photographs." Mira said, "We can have that ready by tomorrow." Dr. Rice looked around the room one more time. She said, "One more thing." She said, "The plant, the species in the growing room, Emmeline's original documentation." She said, "Is there a common name?" Mira looked at Vesta. Vesta said, "Grief tender." Dr. Rice wrote it in her field notebook. She did not ask what it did. Maybe she already knew. Maybe she could feel it just from being in the cave. Mira didn't know. She just watched Dr. Rice write the name in her notebook and felt something in her chest shift, not the pressure that had been there since before she could name when it started, but something quieter. Something that was beginning to understand it might not always be there. Dr. Rice left 2 hours later. She came back through the growing room, took careful notes of the plant conditions, photographed the grief tender with her own camera, and left through the root gap without drama. She did not say what she thought would happen. She said the right people would read the proposal. Mira stood at the cave entrance and watched Dr. Rice disappear into the forest. Then she went back inside. Vesta was at the table. She said, "That went better than I expected." Mira said, "Or worse." "We don't know yet." Vesta said no, but she wrote down the name. People who intend to demolish something don't write down what it's called. She had a point. Mira sat down across from her. She said, "How long until you have to go down?" Vesta said, "Today." She said, "Today." Vesta said, "I've been here 4 days. I have a medical appointment I can't move. My sister thinks I've been at a friend's house." She said, "Does your sister know about this place?" Vesta said, "My sister knows I come to the mountains in October. She doesn't know what for." She said, "Does she know you're ill?" Vesta said, "She knows some of it." A pause. She said, "You should tell her." Vesta looked at her. She said, "I know I'm 17 and I don't know your life." Vesta said, "You're right on both counts." She said, "But you've been maintaining this place alone for 37 years, and we're here now. You don't have to come alone anymore." Vesta was quiet. She said after a moment, "She'll want to come see it." Mira said, "Good. You should bring her." Vesta looked at the vault doorway, at the fire, at the weaving room opening. She said, "I've been carrying this place for a long time." Mira said, "I know." She said, "The way you carry something you don't want to put down because you're not sure it'll still be there when you come back." Mira said, "You can put it down now." She said it simply, not dramatically, not as a comfort, just as a fact. Vesta looked at her. She put both hands flat on the table. She said, "All right." She reached into her jacket pocket. She produced a folded document, not from the workshop files, something she'd been carrying with her. She set it on the table. She produced a pen. She said, "My lawyer prepared this 6 months ago. When I realized I was going to need to make a decision." She unfolded it. A custodianship agreement. Formal language, 3 pages, a space for a signature at the bottom. Mira read it. It was everything she'd asked for in her handwritten proposal and more. The right to maintain the compound, the obligation to continue the renewal cycle, the documentation requirements, the research access provisions, the protection of the natural microclimate, all of it. At the top in the title, Custodianship Agreement, Vein Compound. She said the name was already in here. Vesta said Emmeline left documentation with the original deed. The compound has always been associated with the vein name. My lawyer found it when I asked her to prepare this. She said vein compound. Vesta said her name for it. Mira looked at the document. She picked up the pen. She signed. Her handwriting was not as neat as she wanted it to be because her hand was not entirely steady. But it was legible. It was her name. Mira vein and ink on a document that said this place was her responsibility now. She put the pen down. Vesta said, that's not legally binding until my lawyer countersigns and the notary certifies. Mira said, I know. She said, but it's real. Vesta said, yes. She said, it's real from this moment. She said it the same way she said everything, like an assessment. She folded the document. She put it in her jacket pocket. She said, I'll send you the certified copy by mail. She said, to this address. She said, this cave in the forest. Not like a joke, like a fact. She started to rise. Mira said, Vesta. She paused. Mira said, Emmeline's letter. The copy you have. Can I see it again? Vesta reached back into her pocket. She held it out. Mira opened it to the last paragraph. She read the grief tender works on the nameless kind, the kind that isn't grief at all, but gets called that because we don't have a better word for it. The weight that lives behind the sternum for no reason you can name. She read, it isn't permanent. She read, that's what I want whoever finds this to know. She folded the letter and handed it back. She said, thank you. Vesta put it away. She stood up. She said the clay for the water channel is in the corner of the growing room. You'll need to check it again in December. She said the unfinished piece on the loom. The pattern comes from the back of the old weaving manual on the bottom shelf. Third pattern from the left. She said, and in spring the lovage needs dividing. It's been in the same trough for 7 years. It'll take over everything if you let it. Mira said third pattern from the left. Divide the lovage in spring. Vesta said, yes. She looked at the weaving room one more time. She said, I'll finish that piece. She said it like a promise. She went. She went through the main room and out through the gap in the roots and down the slope into the forest, and the sound of her footsteps on the ground faded. The way sounds faded gradually until it was part of the forest sound and then not there anymore. Mira stood at the cave entrance until she couldn't hear it. Then she went back inside. Luca was in the vault. She found him in the inner alcove in the section with the E-vein label standing at the marked shelf with the small clay vessel in his hand. He said, can I plant it? She said, today. He said, the documentation is done. I have the preparation notes from Emmeline's documentation. The soil in the far trough is the right composition. The conditions are right. She said, that vessel is sealed. Once we open it, he said, I know. He said, but the seed in here is for growing, not for keeping. She looked at him. He was right. She said, is the documentation ready? He said, photographs, label transcription, renewal history, soil requirements from Emmeline's notes. All done. She said, then yes. He opened the vessel carefully. The wax seal came away in a single piece. The cork beneath it was sound. He lifted it and set it aside. He tipped the vessel gently. A single seed, small, gray-brown, unremarkable looking. He set the vessel down. He carried the seed to the far trough. He made a small depression in the dark soil with one finger. He placed the seed. He covered it. He sat back. Dutch came to stand beside him and looked at the soil the way he looked at things he considered significant. Mira watched. She watched her 11-year-old brother sit in the soil of a growing room built in 1912 and plant a seed that had been kept sealed in a clay vessel by a woman named Emmeline Vane for the granddaughter she'd never met. She watched Dutch put his chin on Luca's shoulder. She looked at the grief tender in its corner trough. Alive, compact, gray-green and unremarkable and completely irreplaceably real. She said, "I need the documentation log." Luca handed it to her. He said, "The new one, number 41. It's on the work table." She went to the work table. The new log was there. Luca had started it. The first entries in his careful handwriting, the date, the weather conditions, the water channel status, the temperature reading, the names of the plants he documented, his own initials at the bottom, L. Vane. She picked up the pen. She turned to the next page. She thought about what to write. She thought about formal documentation. She thought about what Emmeline would have written, what the long line of caretakers had written, the careful factual record of what was done and when and how. She was going to write that. She was. But first she picked up her grandmother's journal. She opened it to the page with a long entry, the 40-year search, the end of the road for this particular search. She looked at her grandmother's handwriting. She looked at the last line. Then she looked at the documentation log. She put the pen to the page. She wrote, "Today L. Vane planted the grief tender from Emmeline's documentation vessel. Germination expected in spring soil conditions, favorable trough conditions, optimal per original specifications. All vault renewal records transferred to new documentation log. Custodianship agreement signed." She paused. She looked at the grief tender. She looked at the journal. She wrote, "B, I found it. I know you knew the name. I know you looked. I'm sorry you never made it here. I think you were always looking in the right direction. You just needed to go further back than you could reach." She paused again. She wrote, "It was here the whole time. It was here for you, and now it's here for me, and I'm going to stay with it." She paused. She wrote, "I'm doing all right." She put the pen down. Dutch came to sit beside her feet. Luca came out of the growing room. He said, "I washed the vessel. For the record." She said, "Good." He looked at what she'd written. He said, "You wrote to B in the documentation log." She said, "Yeah." He said, "Is that a format thing we're doing now?" She said, "Maybe." He said, "Okay." He picked up the pen. He turned to the next entry line. He wrote, "The lovage is going to need dividing in spring. Just so you know." He signed it L. Vane. He put the pen down. He said, "There." She said, "There." They sat in the cave together, the two of them and the dog and the fire and the sound of the growing room water moving somewhere in the rock above them. The smell of earth and old wood and dried herbs and something underneath that she couldn't name, but had been breathing for 4 days now without knowing she needed it. Outside, the October light was doing what October light did in Washington state, going low and sideways, finding the spaces between trees at the angle that made everything look like the world had decided to be kind for a moment. The forest beyond the root gap was gold and brown, and the color that wet stone made in low sun. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about the quilt on the table in the weaving room and the wall hanging it matched, and the years between when Emmeline sent it out and when Mira brought it back. She thought about the pressure she'd carried since before she could name when it had started. It isn't permanent. She thought, "B, I know you ran out of time." She thought I didn't. She picked up the documentation log. She read back through everything Luca had written. The methodical record, the dates and the temperatures and the renewal notes. Her brother's careful handwriting, the same handwriting that had been doing homework in a dining room that no longer existed 3 weeks ago. She thought about what it meant to be the person who stayed. Not the person who visited, not the person who checked in once a year. The person who was there when the water channel developed a hairline crack, and when the lovage needed dividing, and when the first seed from Emmeline's original documentation vessel pushed up through the dark soil of the far trough in spring. The person who was there. Some things need a person to stay with them. She thought, I know. She thought, I'm here. Outside, the October light tilted further. The forest made its ordinary sounds. Water somewhere. Birds. The specific quiet of a place that had been keeping itself for a long time. Inside the fire was warm. The grief tender was in its corner. The seed was in the ground. The log was open on the table waiting for the next entry. She picked up the pen. She started writing.